If you have said to yourself, I should write that, or if someone has said to you, you should write that, then I'm talking to you because you need to write. And that's why you're tuned in to yWrite. Hi, welcome back to yWrite. I'm your host, Angela Grout, and thanks for tuning in for another episode where you get to meet some fabulous writers, and I do too. We get to learn what makes them write and why they write, because we want to help ourselves write. So today I have a fabulous guest, and let me tell you about this woman. Her name is Mickey Rathbun, and she started her career as a lawyer in New York City in the 80s. And then she moved to Western Massachusetts with her husband, Chris Bentley, which you may or may not know his name. He's also an author. And she gave up that law career to become a freelance journalist. She has written for the Boston Globe and the Chicago Tribune and Salon.com, and she has written a lot of different topics, including, legal controversies, and we're going to get into some of that when we start talking. But I have to share that recently she has published a book, and it's a memoir. And it's the memoir of a granddaughter. And she is the granddaughter of who most likely was the inspiration for The Great Gatsby. So we have the Great Gatsby's inspirational granddaughter here to share with us her memoir, her writing career. And I want to welcome Mickey Rathbun to the show. Mickey. Hi. Thank you so much for coming in today.
Thank you for having me.
So, we are all the granddaughter of someone, and, and that someone's done something important in the world. And here your grandfather, was most likely the inspiration for the Great Gatsby. And, before we jump into, your writing career, I just want to know, how did you find out that your grandfather was the inspiration?
As I was growing up, I remember always in the background there was this rumor that my mother's father had been a source of inspiration for F. Scott Fitzgerald when he wrote Gatsby.
And they knew each other.
Well, I think they did. That this wasn't discussed a whole lot, but I kind of kept it in the back of my mind. Then I had an interesting experience on my wedding day back in 1983.
Yeah, this is so interesting.
One of the guests at our wedding was a woman named Honoria Donnelly. She was the daughter of Gerald and Sarah Murphy, who were at the sort of epicenter of the Fitzgerald crowd, expatriates living in France. They knew Hemingway. They knew everyone. And Honoria was a very close friend of my parents. And after the wedding and reception, my husband and I had a drink with Honoria and her husband, and we started talking about Fitzgerald and how he had stayed at this house where we had our wedding reception, this historic house out in the country in Virginia. And Honoria said, Fitzgerald stayed there. And I said, oh yeah, my grandfather stayed there too. And Honoria asked me, oh, your grandfather, that's so interesting. She said, I knew your grandfather. He was a very colorful character. And I said, in the back of my mind, I thought, well, Honoria's family was obviously very close to the Fitzgeralds. And I said, I've always heard this rumor that my grandfather was the inspiration for J. Gatsby. And Honoria said, that wouldn't surprise me at all. And I thought, whoa, that's really interesting. So then years went by. I, had a career in law. I had kids, and but I'd always thought about that. And I finally began to research it in 2009 after my father had died. At that point, my parents were both dead. And so I began to track it down, along with a lot of other information I was curious about, having to do with my grandfather's life.
You know, it's interesting how you're saying, like, you know, this seed for this story was planted so long ago. And when, for me, I know, like, if you have that story inside you and it's meant for you to tell, it's going to stay there. You know, it stays there and stays there, nudging you, saying, write me. And you're like, oh, wait, I'm working right now. I have to write for the Chicago Tribune, or I'm working right now and I'm a lawyer, or I'm having children right now. And it's like we kind of put that baby, that little idea on the back burner, but you follow through with it. So
Yes.
kudos to you.
Yes.
And so you've been a writer kind of your whole life in one way or another, between
I would
law
say so.
and everything. You know, what made you, how long did you practice law and then decide, you know what, I'm going to just go full-time into writing?
I practiced law altogether for 7 years. My husband got a teaching job in the English department at Mount Holyoke in South Hadley. So in 1989, we moved up to Western Massachusetts. And I just had my first baby, and I kind of wanted something small to do. So I took a short story class, writing class, with a wonderful writer named Anita Desai. And then I got more and more interested, and I decided it would be fun to try to write, you know, journalism. So I went to the local paper, the Daily Hampshire Gazette in Northampton. And
Where you still write for them today.
I still write for them today.
And
but
I want to get
was-
into the topic you're writing there, but you know, you started writing for them, and how did you move from going from the Gazette to, you know, nationwide publications?
Well, I did food pieces for the Gazette, and then I had some interesting ideas for stories that would be of interest to the Globe, and I pitched those, and they asked me to write those. I have a friend who worked at the Chicago Tribune, and she asked me to do some book reviews, and just all sorts of books. I also had a friend who worked at Sports Illustrated for kids, and she asked me to write for them. So I wrote columns for them.
You've written a genre, a lot of different genres, from, I know you did one for recovery, memory syndrome, and university sexual codes of conduct, to beekeeping and horse racing, and to your grandfather. Like, you've had a lot of different, you know, I'm going to say genres, you know, especially writing for kids in Sports Illustrated, and then writing for the Chicago Tribune, and now writing, I'm going to say horticultural, but you're writing for a gardening section in the Gazette, which, you know, I don't know if you know, I was a former florist. So
Oh, really?
I'm like, oh, that's so cool. I could write about flowers all day long.
Yeah. Yeah, it's been interesting. I have tended to write about things that I'm involved in. So, you know, when my kids were young, they were into sports, and so writing about sports and sports parenting was something that was very much on my mind, and coaching and that kind of thing. So the Sports Illustrated for Kids piece worked very well for me. The Tribune asked me, most of the books I reviewed for them had to do with sports. So that, again, was
Did you
a
play
natural
sports
fit.
as a child, or do you play anything?
Some. I play tennis. I am an equestrian. I have a horse.
You are a lover
and
of
I
horses.
compete.
And so was your grandfather, and Great Gatsby.
Yeah.
So we got a lot of horse stuff going through all of this.
Yeah. I write occasionally for a magazine called The Chronicle of the Horse, which is a sort of national, kind of the magazine that everybody reads, if they're horse people. So I like to write about things that I'm interested in.
Yeah.
And all the features that I've written have been things that I decided I wanted to write about.
Well, and obviously writing your memoir of how you found out that your father, your grandfather was, most likely the inspiration for The Great Gatsby, I mean, is something that you're interested in. So that right away is like, okay, I can research this and get into it. But you're writing what you know because you know your grandfather. You know your family.
Yeah. Well, except I did know my grandfather, although I only knew him when he was very old. But I did not know a lot about him.
What is his name? I know.
George Moore.
Thank you, George Moore. I'm like, wait, I know this. So, yeah, so you knew George Moore, but you were young.
I was young, and he was quite a formal grandfather. He was not a kind of playful, cozy up to kind of guy. My mother's parents, my grandfather and her mother, were divorced when she was 7. She didn't really know her father very well because he traveled a lot. And again, this was back in the 20s. And
hence where all these rumors come from that he's, the inspiration, that, the Fitzgerald family and, people are, seeing him in a different light that you've seen him in.
Exactly. Very different. But I think because my mother had a pretty miserable childhood and was distant from her father, she didn't talk about his life. I don't know if she just didn't know a lot about it but for whatever reason, it just was not something to be discussed.
Well, I can see that. I mean, based on, who the Great Gatsby character is, I can see, like, when you're distant from that type of character, you're, A, could be a little bit jealous that you're not included in that lifestyle. And, obviously, just feel left out of not knowing, that side of a person and not having time with them like that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that's right. And he just wasn't around. So it really wasn't until she died in 2005. And then my father died a few years later. And it was when I was going through his papers, I found a letter that my grandfather had written to him that was attached to this short 12-page draft of a memoir that my grandfather had written about his experience in World War I. And that was something I really didn't know anything about. So that was sort of what finally drew me towards writing the book.
So the writing gene is in the family, too, because here he started his memoir, and you're writing yours almost as a tribute to finish his a little bit.
Yeah, well, that's a good way of looking at it. Yeah.
So, I mean, it's got to be very cool to find something that you weren't looking for that had all this information, sharing his personality, sharing what he's went through and his experiences. But, like, here your mother didn't talk about him much. What was the research like, trying to uncover who he is, and is he this, big man that, is looked at?
The research process was very interesting. I love doing research. Yeah. I have a distant cousin who lives out in Michigan. He had put together a genealogy of my grandfather's family. My grandfather was the youngest of 10 children, born to a couple of Irish immigrants who fled the potato famine in the 1840s. So there was a big family. Yeah. And my cousin Stephen Moore did this amazing job of collecting so much information about all of these, the 10 children, their spouses.
It's so
just
fascinating.
An encyclopedia of
information. I have a cousin who did that with my mother's side of the family, and it was just, I mean, he's written, I think it's like a 600-page book of all of this genealogy, and it's really cool to see, like I have family members that came over on the Mayflower, and, like here you're talking about going back generations, of your own lineage. That's just cool to find out, how we got here. Yeah. So that part I totally understand as being the fun part of research, but you obviously had to do even more, and it sounds like this Helenora was helpful. Honoria, thank you.
Well, she just gave me that one bit, really, but that definitely, piqued my interest in going ahead with the story.
And how long did it take you to, I'm going to say, write this book?
Well,
we can't say, start to finish from the minute you concepted the idea, because then we're going to say decades. But, when you actually started doing the pen to paper, doing the research, and then, publishing.
I would say 14 years.
Yeah.
13 years.
Books have such a long incubation period.
Yeah, yeah.
It's a long pregnancy.
Yes. And I sort of wrote as I did the research. But a big hurdle for me was figuring out what kind of book it was going to be. Because originally I thought, well, this is just a book about my grandfather.
Right.
And then I thought, well, I don't think, although he had a very interesting life, I'm not sure that he is significant enough to just be the subject of a biography. But not only that, I realized that a lot of my interest in him was really tied up in his relationship with my mother and what that was about. So it really turned into this kind of hybrid memoir biography.
Yeah.
Well,
and I think a lot of memoirs can be that way, because even though, a memoir, if you're doing a snapshot of your life, or if you're doing, the whole lifespan, you're including, other people's lives in your memory, because anyone we come in contact with, related to us or not, helps us to become who we are. So even though you didn't know him well, she didn't know him well, it's made you who you are. So I can understand that discovery factor for sure.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And trying to weave together the biography with the more personal stuff, it took a lot of work and a lot of thinking and juggling. And
what was maybe like the hardest or the most surprising thing that you found with researching or about your grandfather?
Well, I wouldn't say this was the hardest thing, but the most interesting thing that I discovered was that my grandfather was very involved for a brief time in the Irish Republican movement in the early part of the 20th century. There was the Easter Uprising in, I think it was 1916. Anyway, he happened to be assigned to go to a meeting in Dublin that was the first time that the Irish Republicans, under the banner of Sinn Féin, got together, elected their own parliament, and declared themselves an independent state. And if you talk to any Irishman, they will say, oh my God, that was sort of like their Declaration of Independence. And my grandfather was there.
He's very world travel. I mean, he did a lot of traveling, especially in the early 20th century, for someone to travel that much. And where was he, I want to use the word stationed, but where did he actually live?
He lived in a lot of places. I mean, in one sense, his early base was Michigan. But he spent a lot of time in New York. He spent a lot of time before World War I and during World War I in London. He had a house there. He went back to New York after the war.
What did he do for work?
He was he called himself a capitalist, which meant that he raised money for, different kinds of projects. His earliest work was putting together what they called traction companies. Traction is the word for like motorized public transportation in urban areas. So when they got rid of horse-drawn trolley cars, they began to have motorized trolley cars. And my grandfather was in on the ground floor in that. So he made a lot of money doing that. He invested in real estate. He invested in natural resources.
So he was an intelligent man.
He was.
I mean, he definitely
was extremely intelligent.
Yeah, and I'm going to say, well liked among his peers, where he's getting all these invitations to kind of, go to these major historical moments,
Mm-hmm.
And so, I mean, all of that is just like really fascinating because, you're right. They go from, horse-drawn wagons to motorized, cars, and, he's in on the ground floor. And because when you're saying, oh, he has a house in London and, he went to Dublin, and I'm thinking, where's he getting all his money to do all this traveling?
Yeah. Yeah, well, he made a lot of money, and then he continued to work with investors, put together syndicates. One crazy thing he did, he had a group of British investors who on their behalf, he bought 100,000 acres of prime timberland in western North Carolina. And he totally fell in love with western North Carolina and the Smoky Mountains. And he took as what he called his perquisite, sort of his pay for putting this deal together. He got a long-term lease on 1,600 acres on a mountaintop in the Western Smokies. And on that mountaintop, he built an exotic hunting lodge.
Wow.
And he imported bears from Germany.
And all of this you found out by doing your research.
Yes.
Because you didn't know any of this from family stories.
No, I did not.
Wow, this is like fascinating. That's intense research. I mean, I can see you going through looking at the deeds for the lands and things like that. And wow. Kudos to you for doing all that research. I know how much time that takes.
Yeah.
And then to sit down and piecemeal and weave it all together in this beautiful story in the quilt form, to put everything, that's just a huge undertaking. And, anyone out there who is looking to do a memoir, I mean, there is research to do,
Yeah.
So,
well, one thing I'll say, too, about the North Carolina hunting lodge, I went down there and I visited the place and I met people who had known, everyone down there knows about my grandfather. I mean, you say his name and they're like, oh, wow. And, I met people. Someone took me actually to the site of the hunting lodge, although nothing is left now except sort of some stones where the foundation was. But in terms of research, I can't stress enough to people who want to do this kind of writing, you really have to get out from behind your desk and go places and meet people. And not
just the library or the...
Exactly.
I mean, it's so fun that you walked the land, the fact that, you're here, your wedding is held in, the place where your grandfather stayed. And then you get to go visit the places that he lived and worked and created. So, I mean, that's like some fun research.
It was.
All of this is in the story. Mm-hmm. And do you talk about your adventures visiting these places?
Yeah. I mean, it was a very personal experience. I mean, every place I went was very resonant for me. I went to the place where he was born. I went out to California where he had this fabulous 23,000 acre ranch in Carmel. I visited that. I went to London and out to the Cotswolds where he traveled.
You're like chasing
I've been to
Grandpa.
Dublin. Yeah, I mean, I actually went there, and I think now for writers and I know I fall into this trap. There's so much available on the internet, and you can do so much interviewing by email and texting that I think people have gotten more uncomfortable about going out to places.
And things get lost in translation.
Yeah.
I mean, it's so much easier to sit down and talk to someone and let them tell you a story as opposed to reading the story.
Oh, yeah.
And I just think, it'd be so cool to go and visit, like, even where, like, my grandmother was born, and just thinking about, the steps that she took. And, we all have these memories in our family that, rumors or stories that we hear. And it's like, just to go witness it with our own feet and our own eyes, and, allowing almost, them to witness it again through us, because we are their new creation.
Definitely. That's
You are the new creation of your grandfather, and it's just really cool to see that, that the love you have for him, and knowing, that your mom and him were kind of separated, that there's still that family love bonding that, kept you going all these years, saying, someday I think I'm going to write a book about my grandfather. Everyone's telling me he was the inspiration for The Real Gatsby. I wonder if he really was. And here we have this beautiful bound book. With, the great horse, because we're in you and all the horses. And did you take this picture?
No.
Because I know you love horses, so I'm like, how did you pick out the exact horse for it?
Oh, that was, there was a sort of society and sports photographer out in California named Julian Graham, and he took a lot of pictures of my grandfather.
And there's a lot of
family.
pictures in the book, which I think is, a lot of memoirs, it's just prose. But here, you actually have a lot of pictures in here. Was it hard to do the formatting to put these pictures in? Did your publisher do this?
Oh, yeah, the book designer did all that.
But you still had to get all these photos.
Yes.
You can tell just, I'm going to quickly just flip through. Like, you can see, there's a lot here. So, it's just beautiful. George Moore is very proud that his granddaughter has written a book like this, and it's The Real Gatsby, George Gordon Moore, written by the granddaughter's memoir, Mickey Rathbun. And how does it make you feel to see the book?
Oh, it's really exciting. Yes.
Like to hold the baby in the hand, right?
Yeah. It is, it's kind of a miracle when you just start out with nothing, and then all of a sudden, you've got this. Well, it's not all of a sudden exactly, but finally.
Well, I congratulate you for writing this book. And if you want to tell the audience where they can buy the book to read it and where they can find more information about you, I know that you do some book talks. And, this might be a book that book clubs might want to start reading, and who knows?
I hope so.
Yeah, it would be great. So where can they get the book?
The book is available on Amazon and various other online, internet booksellers.
Yeah.
That's the best way to get it.
And they can visit you or contact you through your website.
Yes, and my website is Mickey Rathbun, all one word, .com.
Yeah. Okay, and I'll put the links below so that people can click on them and get to all of them. And again, thank you so much for coming on the show today.
Thank you for having me.
I'm in awe. I'm congratulating you, and I know that the audience has learned so much about the writing process from your writing process, and just, we all want to know more about George Moore and you.
Great. Well, thank you.
You're welcome. Thank you. And I want to thank my studio, 954, for allowing the show to be possible. And I want to thank you, my listening audience and watching audience that tunes in every week to find out more about yWrite. So this is the point in the program where I'm going to tell you, pick up your pen right after the show ends. Set your timer, whether it's on your watch or your phone or your microwave, just for 5 or 10 minutes, and just start writing. I'm going to give you a writing prompt. And, we all have a memoir to write. There's not one of us that doesn't have a memoir to write. And whether it's a snapshot of a single moment in your life of, that first time I ever saw a horse or petted a horse or rode on a horse, right there is just a little snapshot memory. But maybe there's someone in your family that it has made an influence on you in some way, and you're interested and curious to find out more. So why don't we take the next 5 minutes and start writing about the person who has influenced you that you'd like to know more about. And as you write about this, even just start writing questions about what you want to learn and know about them, because you might just have a research project for yourself to do, and you'll be creating your own memoir. So thank you so much for tuning into yWrite. I'm your host, Angela Grout, and I'll see you next time.